There we go. Also, no one was hearing me. I just gave the secret answer before I was unmuted. You had to be here to hear it. But anyway, I'll keep going. And the idea was then to conduct interviews with people, to talk to them, and qualitative interviews about how the kind of things they dislike. I could talk about this in questions if you want, but methodologically, we thought it was important not to start with the dislike and also not to recruit as, hey, come and tell us about all the things you dislike. Part of that is, as I'll talk about, it was a study of dislike, not of hate. But there are 8 interviewers who did the interviews along with, in addition to myself, most in the US, some in Malawi, some online. And this is the table of contents, but for today, what I'm going to do is just focus on some, drawing partly from the intro to talk about the idea of what I wanted to do with the book as a whole, and then thinking about 3 particular chapters. And the situation for this, right, is a sort of super-like economy, right? All the magical algorithms that are supposed to know everything about us. So much of what gets fed back to us is about like. You know, Amazon will tell me the things it thinks I might like, and I turn on Netflix, it tells me the things I might want. And on Facebook, I can see how many people have liked something. I can't see how many have disliked. I can see an angry emoticon, but that's not entirely the same thing. Twitter has that love. And I don't mean to be obtuse, because I'm sure, of course, behind all of these, the visibility of like, there are decisions being made about what I won't like. You know, Netflix won't tell me to watch certain things it doesn't think I dislike, but it never signals that dislike. There's never a point in my life where I've tried to buy something on Amazon and a little pop-up says, no, actually, we don't think you'll like that. Or that Netflix says, you know, we found that most people who like this don't like this, so you should stay away from it. And so the centering of like is so central that what is interesting is what do we center the dislike? Particularly because we also, you know, there's lots of discussion about a balanced media diet, and you hear this used both in academic discussion about audiences and in just everyday life discussion about audiences. And yet what I find interesting is even though we're using the word diet, so often there's that discussion turns to what we are eating. When, I don't know about you, but I tend to know the difference between diets based more on what you're not allowed to eat. And so again, flipping it, what I was thinking is, okay, rather than talking about what we can eat, well, how about we talk about what people are allergic to? What do we talk about what people have intolerances of, what they have bad memories of and they don't want to eat, what they won't eat because no one in their family can eat, right? If we're using that metaphor of diet, it opens up all these other things that happen with the diet. Just to throw some numbers here, I mean, the big American one is that, and these are figures from a year ago because I didn't update with this year's, but I'm sure it's around the same. Around 100 million Americans watch the Super Bowl, which is a huge number, right? And what that means is almost 1 in 3 million, almost 1 in 3 Americans is watching this show. But what that also means is over 2 out of 3 Americans are not watching. And I find that fascinating because this signature event that is sold to Americans is the thing that we are all watching or that you must be watching. News people will sign off before that weekend on sort of, what are you doing you know, this week, Jill? Oh, thanks for asking, Brad, we're doing this. And there's this whole suggestion, right, that we are all engaged in this, and yet 2 out of 3 Americans aren't. And if it is this signature event, it seems if we wanted to know what the Super Bowl meant, for instance, why we can't just ask the 1 out of 3. We have to ask the other 2 out of 3. What does the Super Bowl mean to those people who are not watching or aren't interested? Australian version, Wikipedia tells me the single highest television broadcast of all time in Australia was the 2021 AFL Grand Final, where 15.2% of Australians tuned in to watch. So huge amount didn't. Or if you want real fun numbers, we go to China and we see the legend of Bruce Lee when it was broadcast. 400 million Chinese watched, which is, you know, more than the population of the US and Australia put together, and yet it still means 1 billion didn't. And so if you want to ask about the cultural life of this project, we have to ask about that. Just a few more little numbers to throw at you. The one that I find particularly fascinating in the American context is that Fox News, as much as, you know, it's famous internationally for being such a thriving, beating heart of American conservatism, on any given night has 3 million Americans watching it, which is paltry. That means that 99% of Americans aren't watching Fox News. Now, that's more than are watching other news channels. So there's not like a yay CNN conclusion here. But it's part, I think it needs to be, it could be factored into the discussion about what American conservatism is, because what this surely means is the vast majority of American conservatives are not watching Fox News. And if we want to talk about what Fox News is as a cultural entity, we need to talk about that too. And then these other figures are all figures going from around the world, where these two, if we're playing some, it's very dubious math. What I've tried to do is take box office sales, work out average box office, average ticket price, and then you make a crazy assumption, which is that no one's engaging in piracy. So obviously these numbers should change, but still what we have is that in a legitimate market, 96% of the world have didn't watch Avengers Endgame. 98% haven't seen the last Star Wars. And the best-selling music album of 2 years ago was BTS's Love Yourself, which 99.97% of the world did not buy. And again, I'm not trying to be sort of obtuse and say, therefore, these things are all failures. But my interest is how everything that is a success is also a failure to other people. Once you rocket something into popular culture, we now need to talk about all of its audiences. We have to talk not just about the people who love, it has a sense of great meaning for, because of positive connection, but we also have to think about negative connections. Indeed, moving over into academia, what we have is this incredible toolkit for understanding love. This is just a small selection of the books on fandom. There's so much work on fandom. Indeed, I gave a version of this talk at University of Huddersfield in England. And as I looked out and I saw Matt Hills and Cornell Sandboss, I realized that between Matt, Cornell, and I, we had published, between the three of us, there were more books about fandom by the three of us than there were books about dislike and anti-fandom globally, right? From the field. That's starting to change. We're starting to see more about anti-fandom, particularly the level of hate. But it shows that there's this radical sort of imbalance in terms of some of the toolkit that we have for understanding negative engagement. And so the idea behind this project was to go after dislike. I should say that, I double underline dislike, not hate. An earlier erroneous Jonathan Gray, publishing in 2003, smushed all negative affect together and sort of suggested that we could come up with this thing called anti-fandom. I'm working against that guy because he was wrong to think that they were the same. And I think there have been some people who like Emma Jane has some really good, a couple of really good articles really taking that Jonathan Gray to task for some of the problematic ethical assumptions that roll on from an excitement in studying what might be hate speech and what might be aggressive. And I wanted to get away from that sort of aggression. It's hard to get away from it completely because a lot of times people say they hate something and what they mean is they dislike it, right? I think of in pure terms, hate means you want elimination. You probably want death of. So if you hate a singer in the true means of that, you would like them to be killed. Or you would like to see them reduced to complete and abject poverty and pain and suffering. When I say I hate Celine Dion, I don't mean that. I just mean I don't like her music. But we all do that discursively. So sometimes it meant digging through this. It also meant staying away from casual dislike. So, there are plenty of shows which I don't like. Why don't I like them? I don't know. And what I wanted to do is get beyond that into a more sort of passionate statement of why people dislike things. So moving on then, the three sections I want to look at is first I want to think about the inescapability of dislike and how that idea of inescapability and therefore how much of our consumption is of things that we don't actually choose to be consuming and how that actually flies in the face of a lot of the rhetoric around the sort of new media economy. I then want to talk a bit more about performing and articulating identity. And then I'll talk about what I call tips of icebergs. What I mean is the degree to which I was excited by how often when when we started asking people about dislike, we started to see this big iceberg appear of all the things that they perhaps wanted more from television, particularly, but also of other media. Well, let's start with this idea of the inescapable objects of dislike. And if you've done qualitative research, you know it's entirely rare that everyone you talk to says one thing in common. But that's why it was rare that I'd say everyone we talked to shared this sense that the thing that they disliked was something that was inescapable, that was ubiquitous, they couldn't get away from. And I think that's fascinating for reasons I'll come back to. But what got me into this, I'll just say quickly, was when my previous monograph was on Show So Separately was about paratext. And so I was interested in how often when we're engaging with text, we may not actually be consuming the work itself. So think about, you go to watch a movie, you see the trailers. It's unlikely you'll go on to watch all of those movies, but you're now responding to, if someone says, why aren't you going to watch that movie? You might say, oh, it looks like crap. I don't like the acting. It's not the genre I like. You're responding to it. You're interpreting it, even though you've not seen the thing itself. And I was fascinated, if you sort of extrapolate, how often that means that so many of our textual interactions are precisely with things that we're not consuming or interacting with in that traditional sort of fanish close engagement style. And as I was working on this got me especially interested then in all the interactions we have with things that we dislike. You know, when something is out there like the Super Bowl or the AFL Grand Final or something that we're hearing about that we can't avoid, it's very likely that we'll have some kind of interaction with it. It means something to us. If someone says, why aren't you watching that? You can probably come up with a good reason for it. And thinking about, therefore, how many of our interactions work at that level, which is what springboarded me into this project. Because, of course, the fascinating thing, right, is anything that's super successful, and all of these are just a selection of super successful, you know, media texts. If you give me 6 seconds on Google, I can find you a large community of people who come together around a shared dislike of these texts. And indeed, I'm sure probably all of you are, if you know any of these texts, you know people who don't like them. You know, you've heard some of the scripts that follow the dislike. Anything that's a success is by nature a huge failure too. And so that was this interest of realizing that because it's a success, it's always in people's faces. And therefore, there are a lot of people who feel they can't get away from it. Which is interesting, given that, as I said, the rhetoric that we're constantly hearing is that we're in an era in which you watch what you want, when you want, on demand, how you want, which suggests that we should be beyond all that. And yet, one of the things I found interesting here is I conducted a survey with a student of mine where we talked to just over 600 people a few years ago. And when we asked them who chooses or participates in choosing what to watch, we were expecting, you know, the rhetoric sort of suggested that everyone was just me, I choose. And yet so many people are still watching things that are, maybe it's not even not their choice, but they're talking about what to watch with other people, which suggests that still there's a lot that a lot of things or faces being put in front of that we didn't choose to be there. And this counters, again, even just if there's one reason why a lot of people may not have studied dislike, it's because there might be, intuitively, we might think, well, if you don't like it, just don't watch it. I mean, here's two, you know, heavyweights in television studies giving a version of that. Roger Silverstone, in a very, you know, beautiful metaphor, says it's like an omelet. It just slips out of the pan. If you don't like it, it's fine. John Hartley is saying that media, one of the things that he finds interesting about media is that they're less, and popular entertainment is less coercive than many other things. Well, maybe the media themselves aren't coercive, but the people might be coercive. And this is what we are finding again and again then, that people, there are all sorts of varieties of this. The people who you live with, it might be their choice to watch something, not your choice. And sometimes that's not even necessarily coercive. We had a lot of times where people would tell us, you know, like, I love my partner and this show brings great joy to my partner. So when we sit down and say, what should we watch? I'll say, we should watch that thing that you love. But then you sit there going, oh, I don't like this thing. And so there's all sorts of versions of this. Think about also, even just that idea of choice makes it sound as though anytime you sit down to watch, like you both come along and sit down together and turn on, when quite often, like, we walk into a room in which something's already happening. And I've used TV as an example, but it was even more the case when we think about other media. I mean, like, when do you get to go into a store and tell them what music you want to shop to, right? You don't get to make those decisions. There's so many, so much of the media that surrounds us we don't have choice of. We talked to someone, I remember, who was a nurse, who talked about her workplace and saying that, you know, she worked at palliative care with lots of old Americans who just wanted to watch Fox News all the time. She didn't have the choice of telling them, no, we can't watch this. When your friends decide that you're going to go out and watch this movie instead of that. And then even just the idea of public space, even if you can get all your friends and loved ones and roommates behind the idea that we're not going to watch this, it's hard to go out into public space and avoid that. I have a good friend who hates spoilers and takes it to a crazy degree, so that when the new Star Wars trilogy was announced, he was adamant that he was going to avoid any spoilers around it. And we all had to curate his entire life. Like, we told him, you can't go to Target because Target has lots of Star Wars stuff. He would literally get out in the middle of like trailers and run out of the room because he'd see the Lucasfilm logo. He said at the end, he just realized he couldn't, it was unmanageable, that Star Wars was going to get him. We had lots of parents saying, I can tell my child not to watch princess stuff from Disney, but they're going to find it at school. It's going to be there. So that's something that happens to us all, but I was particularly interested in, are there some people who have to do more of this coerced, forced viewing than others? And that's one of the things that really interested me in our data, was realizing that there might be a privilege in being able to turn off the channel, or in being able to find something else to watch. So if we take me as an example, people like me, of my demographics, are what Hollywood makes tons of stuff for. You know, I'm a cis straight man. I'm middle class. I'm in my 40s. There's so much media created for the likes of me. If I don't like something, there's always something on another channel that I can like. But not everyone has that privilege. And I think of Andre Cavalcante has this great book called Struggling for Ordinary, where he does qualitative audience research with trans audiences, asking how they interact with representations of trans people. And what he comes up with this idea of resilient reception. And he says they have to steel themselves. You know, I won't read these quotes, but a lot of them are positively affective, that when he asks them about watching themselves on, or other people who are trans on screen, they're often, their bodies are shaking because they know that the trans character is going to be victimized or is going to be ridiculed, even in depictions where seemingly we're treating the trans character with care. So often they end up getting beaten to death at the end, or so forth. And he talked to people who said, you know, they would still go to see these movies because often, you know, their loved ones meant well. They'd say to them, oh, we've seen this movie and there's a trans character, let's all go together. And they meant it as a sort of sign of love, but they know full well what's going to happen to that trans character. And so this, reading that got me thinking about, are there some people who, you know, are on the other end of, you know, my privilege of just being able to change the channel, who their everyday experience may be so much dislike. Which then also got me thinking about this binary that so often gets used in fan studies between it's a crude binary, but still, affirmational fans, those who just love it all, and transformational fans, you know, Henry Jenkins' textual poachers, the ones who want to get something and wrestle with it because there's bits of it they like, but there are other things they don't, and so they're going to write, say, fan fiction to cure that part of it. And again, this is crude, but in fan studies, this has often been superimposed onto a notion of privilege. This idea that privileged viewers are the ones, and in the society center, maybe the ones who are most able to be affirmational fans. And that those self-declared fangirls, either women and or queer audiences, are further distance from privilege, may not have the ability as often to just sort of go, oh yeah, I love everything about this. But if that's a binary, well, let's make it a spectrum and think that we could keep going and think about dislike, right? If one position is, I love everything about it, and another is, I'm negotiating with it, surely there's another one, which is, I just can't stand this. There's nothing I want to do with any of this. And that also then means we might think about the audiences who are more often forced into that position. And this is what troubled me, because I feel like cultural studies, so much of the mission of talking to audiences was thinking about people's everyday engagements with hegemony and centralization and marginalization. And I worry that audience studies so often has become fan studies. And I worry, who are we missing if we're just talking to fans? And we might be missing some of the very audiences who might be able to answer some of those questions that first motivated audience studies in the cultural studies tradition. Indeed, here's Henry Jenkins talking about, he says, the schoolgirl required to read a boy's book, the teenager dragged to see her date's favorite slasher film, the housewife forced to watch her husband's cop show rather than her soap, ... What Jenkins says is, these people might all become textual poachers. Whereas I'm thinking of an alternate future, which is ... These people can't stand the thing that they're being asked to watch. And so it was that idea of moving on. Just before I move on myself to the next section, just a couple of quotes from Simon Frith that I really like, where he's talking about noise. And he says, the problem is not volume as such, measured by decibels, but the feeling that someone else's music is invading our space. And I like that idea of thinking about the way to which like our media environments are invaded. That we don't want something there. It's an unwanted presence, and yet how often our engagements are precisely with that unwanted presence. What are the things that include us or exclude us? And so my mini conclusion for this section is that audience research needs to be as much or more about what people don't like or choose as about what they do like or choose. Which is not to say that we need to stop what we've been doing all along, but it's this whole extra project, right? To go back to that sort of Super Bowl number, 2 out of 3 people are not being consulted about what they think about this. So let's talk to them. Well, I now want to say a few things about performing and articulating identity, which, as I said, I mean, this was Bourdieu's notion of what happens with dislike. It's a performance, an articulation of classed identity. When I say performance, I'm thinking in a sort of more Judith Butler term and using scripts of identity and articulating and creating and reifying those scripts. I'm not thinking of it in a sort of pejorative, like, oh, that person's so performative. But what I was fascinated is how often when people started talking about their dislikes, we were hearing them tell us important things about themselves, things that they really cared about. And those things weren't just class snobbery. So to go through some examples, Julie was a really interesting example here. As I said, I can talk about this later, about why we did this, but the first half of our interviews were nearly always asking people what they liked and how they engaged with things that they liked. And then when we got to, we didn't ask about demographics until the end of the interview. But when we finally turned to talking about dislike with Julie, she came out of the gates saying how much she disliked Undercover Boss. I don't know if there's an Australian version of this, but Undercover Boss, there is? Oh, no. Okay, you know, okay. Oh, so you get it. So you've seen. So I mean, and what Julie says is she hate, all of a sudden we never knew, Julie hadn't said anything about her class positioning, but the rest of the interview is all about her experience of watching as someone who grew up working class and how she hates seeing how so much American TV is just fueled by this love of CEOs and this need to rescue the CEO as this caring, loving figure. And so through talking about this dislike and her engagement with things that she dislikes, she's able to tell us this thing about herself that she just couldn't when we were talking about fandom and about like. Boyd, these are all pseudonyms, by the way. Boyd was originally from Ethiopia, living in the US. Boyd was interesting because he wanted to be interviewed by us, and yet then had next to nothing to say in the first half of the interview. It was sort of like, well, why are we here anyway? And then we got to talk about dislike, and now he woke up because now he had the things to say. He didn't have much to say when the frame was, what do you like? But when the frame is, what do you dislike? he jumped in on the fact that he hated American news because whenever American news depicted Ethiopia or Africa, all he saw was othering and pity and horrible misinformation in his eyes. And it metastasized for him to think just, well, if they're lying about Ethiopia and Africa, they must be lying about everything. I don't trust the news. And I don't trust American TV at all. American TV at large is, and we'll come back to him for that reason, but American TV at large is problematic. And so he then got to talk to us so much about how much the experience of being Ethiopian colored his viewing. And indeed, he talked to us about how this was something he regularly talked to other people about. It became a sort of resource for him. Another clear example here is Deanna, who is an upper middle class Black woman living in a very white town, who worried a lot about third person effects, really worried about what all her white neighbors were thinking about her and her Black family when they were watching representations of Black people on TV. And when she talked about what she really disliked, it was the Basketball Wives franchise, which the name sort of suggests what it is. It's a reality show about very wealthy wives of professional basketball players. In the first season, all of whom were African American. And she says, you know, that show set all women, Black women in particular, back about 30 years. It's the worst mess on television. And I love this. She starts thumping the table when she says this. It's horrible, horrible, horrible. And Deanna's interview is fascinating because the first half hour, if I was doing fan studies research, it was a treasure trove. She could say about all sorts of things that she loved on television, but it was all articulated to her being a woman. As a woman, I love this. She had a lot to say about Grey's Anatomy as a woman and so forth. Never, if you read the transcript, you'd have no idea that she was African American until we shifted to talking about dislike. The vocabulary of fandom was entirely adequate for her to say lots of things about herself, about her engagement with television in relation to her being a woman. But if you wanted to talk about race, she needed to move into the register of dislike. And then we get that. I'll come back to her in a second again, too. And then we have Bob, just one more example here, who Bob was a gay man who worked at a business place where everyone else was straight. And Bob's interesting because he showed the degree to which sometimes objects of dislike almost get liked because they can serve such a powerful role as a cultural resource. That Bob really disliked how Cam and Mitch, the gay couple on Modern Family, were so heteronormed, and they weren't queer like him and his friends. And he constantly needed to tell his coworkers, that's not what, you know, my friends and I are like. This is not how all gay men are like. And telling us about this, it was clear that there was a degree to which Modern Family was actually really useful to him, because it served as this sort of way to, like, not to us as the interviewers, but in his everyday life to turn to the people around him who he wanted to understand more about him and say, see those guys? No, not like that. It's very different. So my little mini conclusion to this section is just, I mean, it should be super intuitive, but we've talked a lot in media cultural studies about how identity is performed and articulated through fandom, but we can see just as much of this through dislike. And often in cases, as I've suggested here, where maybe the vocabulary of fandom doesn't get some people far enough. Well, in the last section, I just want to talk about what I call tips of icebergs. And I mentioned earlier there what I'm interested in this degree. This was the thing that actually surprised and delighted me in the interviews, is that I've done a lot of qualitative interviews throughout my career, and they're often fairly contained. We end up talking about the text. We end up getting in a very sort of geeky sort of spin cycle. But what was interesting in these interviews was how often they really broaden out to people talking about things that they think are wrong with the media in general, or things that they really wish would be different. We started talking a lot more about big picture society. I think that's because what we heard again and again is the dislikes, or the things that people are passionate about disliking, are important precisely because they're representative. They're especially bad at doing something that bugs people and in talking about what that thing that bugs them is, they can talk about this unmet need. They can talk about this thing that they wish was happening instead. You know, in media and cultural studies, we went down this line following John Fiske and so forth of asking about making do, you know, in Dissertoian terms. And I'm all for that line of research, but sometimes we need to stop and say, well, not how do you make do with this, but if you could just scrap the system and created something in which you didn't make do, what would you create instead? And I was really excited to hear that. And it would happen in two modes. The most obvious and what we expected mode is what I call the worst violator, which is when you ask people, what do you really dislike? They tell you the thing that they think is the worst. That makes sense, right? I only frame it that way because we'll come back to how that doesn't always work that way. But Boyd's a clear example of this. What does he dislike most? American TV news. He also thinks most American TV is bad. He thinks American media is full of misinformation. American media doesn't care about the rest of the world. American TV is only interested in sort of patriotic, you know, national identity exercise. In talking about news, it opens this door to this much bigger, mixed metaphor, opens a door to an iceberg, opens a door on the Titanic, looks out, sees the iceberg. There we go. That's how those metaphors connect. So there's one example there. Or to give you another example, Rachel was a parent. We heard this from a lot of parents who, you know, sort of had these things that their kids engaged with, which they couldn't stand. And her thing was she just couldn't stand all of these dolls that had, you know, that were super emaciated and seemed to be like selling, you know, body dysmorphia and all sorts of real sort of dissatisfactions with how, you know, her 8-year-old was engaging with her body. And Bratz dolls were the ones that she particularly disliked. But in talking about Bratz dolls and saying, you know, I wish we could go on Target and rip their heads off, say we're better than this society. She's not just talking about Bratz dolls, right? It's her way of talking about this coursing vein that she sees running through the media in general and through toy life in general. But as I said, what was interesting is as much as people talk about worst violators, more common when I ask people, what do you really dislike, is the things that they were most passionate about were the things that actually failed them. The things that weren't categorically the worst, but the things that could have been better. So for Deanna, we go back to her. As I said, what she desperately wanted was the white women around her to see a show that did reflect the kind of blackness that she saw going on in her family. And so she sees this reality show with upper middle class Black women in, and she thinks, oh great, this could be it. But no, it fails her. Now, on one level, we see the tip of the iceberg here too. I mean, it's hyperbolic, but still in her postulation that one show has set us back 30 years. Think about that. If you think that one show could set things back 30 years, you're telling us how horribly tenuous you think that the progress of the development, the progress of representation of Black women has been over time, that one show could mess it up. And so then for the rest of the interview, she has a lot to say about media and its representation of Black women. But meanwhile then, on the unmet expectation, one of the reasons that she's so disappointed in it, and why she dislikes it, is because it could have done something more for her. And so we see the similar thing with Bob then too. Bob is actually really self-reflexive in his interview, where he sort of says, look, don't get me wrong, the show's not homophobic or anything like that. Like, and I know guys who are like Cam and Mitch. I can't stand them, but they exist in the real world. It's not as though this is a form of gay masculinity that doesn't exist. It does. It's just not what it's not the version I need my coworkers to see. And so he's very reflexive about the fact that, like, you know, it's not actually the worst. It's an okay show, but he needed it and wanted it to be something more. And in talking about that, what he's really saying is actually nothing about Modern Family, therefore, or very little. He's saying much more about this gaping omission in media representations of queer life in general. One of my interviewers, so granted we kind of went looking for this, but one of my interviewers was really interested in talking to self-professed feminists about deal breakers, shows that they either couldn't watch because of their feminist values, or that they watched and then stopped watching. So Game of Thrones figured heavily because of all the rapes and Game of Thrones. But the other thing that featured heavily was this, quattro of Tina Fey, Amy Schumer, Lena Dunham, and Taylor Swift. They were constantly framed as the worst. She's the worst person in the media. Why? Because they were prominent feminists who owned the fact that they were feminists, and therefore dangled this carrot in front of these women in terms of, someone's finally saying they're feminists. Pretty rare. And yet they weren't intersectional feminists. Their feminism was wholly white. It existed only for white women and white upper middle class women. And so it was the sense of failure that was palpable. I often think about this. In fact, some of these interviews were coming in when the primaries were happening, the Democratic primaries in the US. And I think about how often this works politically too, right? That there were so many times where Bernie Sanders supporters would talk about Joe Biden as though he was 40 times worse than Donald Trump, and vice versa. And I think we all do this, right? We can, there's an efficiency to it on one level, right? Like these feminists, when you ask them what's worse, they don't say 2.5 Men, which is obviously way worse than Taylor Swift. But 2.5 Men is so far gone. Why direct our bile against something that will never listen to us in the first place? Whereas maybe Amy Schumer will listen to you, or at least she should have. And similarly then in politics, I think we often direct our anger against the person who might listen. One last example here would be Andrea, who again, like Bob, super self-reflexive. In fact, she wasn't an academic, but if she was, she probably would have, because she gives the version of basically saying, I know I'm kind of like reviewer 2 here saying, could you please write the essay I would have written instead of the one that you've written? She knows that Breaking Bad was not about a teen with cerebral palsy. But when she saw this show in which Walt White's kid has cerebral palsy, she thinks, finally, we're going to get a show that talks about disability. Finally, it's going to be there front and center in American television. And then that's not really important to the show. And what you see is this idea of her just grasping, she knows perhaps it's unfair to ask of it, but it's one of the only things that held out the offer to her. And so we hear this sort of real sense of what more she would have liked from the media. And which got me thinking then about like anti-fan object relations. In fan studies, there's a lot of discussion of object relations. So Matt Hills talks about that the relationship with the fan and the fan object is that of, it's the primary transitional object. It's like the teddy bear that a kid has, that you invest with all the sense of the feelings of warmth and happiness. It's your happy place. Well, we might then think about dislike, how text can similarly become super symbolic of everything that is not happiness, all of the worst in the world. Cornel Sandvoss similarly gets very worried about the degree to which fans might be narcissistic. They project their own image of who they think they are onto the text, and then look at the text and go, oh, aren't you a beautiful text? You look just like me. And they're not engaging with otherness. They're not engaging with difference. And we might think about the degree to which dislike is precisely a symbolic of difference, of otherness. Well, I need to wrap up, but my little mini section wrap up is just, if we want to hear citizens' thoughts about their ideal preferred world, both media and real, often dislikes are a key site for doing so. I was really excited about how often these discussions nominally, about a discussion about why Basketball Wives is an awful show can turn into a 30-minute, brilliant discussion about the state of representation of Black women in television and film, and why that matters to society, why American society in particular, because that was Deanna's interest, needed this. And so I just then finally conclude with a couple of extra quotes here. One from Jan Saradway, who in her early work on reading romance fiction. I love this idea. She says, the act of purchase does not always signify approval. It can just as easily testify to the existence of an ongoing, still only partially met need. And I love this idea of like an audience studies sort of goes more after partially met needs and thinking about, like, not just, as I said, the making do, but what isn't the media doing? What could it be doing? What can we learn from there? And then I'd also turn to Nina Eliasov, who has this really cool book called Avoiding Politics, where the subtitle is How Americans Produce Apathy in Everyday Life. And she's interested in how often Americans don't talk about politics because they think it's improper to do so. And therefore, they have all these political desires and interests and concerns that they won't allow themselves to talk about. And I love this first line. She says, can people possess values just as they possess other objects that may lie in the closet gathering dust? And she sees these people have all these sort of values that matter, but they won't allow themselves to talk about it. One of the things I found fascinating reading this book, it's not a work of media cultural studies, it's largely sort of poli-sci adjacent, is that the few moments where people do allow themselves, they often, the thing that opens the door is often talking about the media. It's often something they saw on a late night TV show or so forth. I think it was the value that Jon Stewart had, particularly the moment where every American on the left was watching The Daily Show. So many discussions would begin, did you watch The Daily Show last night? And you could talk about anything politically as long as you began with that phrase. But I'm also interested in the degree to which dislike might be similarly a springing the door wide open into this realm that people's dusty values, if you will. But with that, I'll shut up and I'll turn over to questions. Thank you so much.